Hey 3DMJers, this is Andrea Valdez, and you're listening to the 3D Muscle Journey podcast. This is our 200th episode, and as we do every 10th episode, this is an audience-supplied Q&A session where we do our best to answer as many queries as possible within the best of our abilities. Today, I'll be doing the asking, and Brad Loomis and Eric Helms will be doing the answering. The first questions from this episode came from the case study Q&A page on our website, which you can always find at 3dmusclejourney.com/QA. And the rest of them came from responses to an Instagram post we made on recording day where we asked for submissions. So if you don't follow us there, please do so. Our handle is at Team3DMJ. Now, I'm not going to lie, on the first two questions, the guys went hard and took a whole lot of twists and turns, and it honestly feels like they answered like 5 additional questions in the process of getting through those first couple, so they were absolutely worth it. And also, at the end, we went like double time, maybe even triple or quadruple time, and we like quick fired the heck out of a lot of the IG questions, so you'll have to keep your ears open and focus intently as we round out the last few minutes of the show. Topics covered in this episode will include whether or not you need to use RPE, how RPE and RIR are related, velocity loss during lifts, the physiology of DOMs, how and why fatigue can cause visual changes in your physique, how to pick the right bodybuilding division for yourself, learning whether to focus on preferences versus success in bodybuilding shows, why you shouldn't care about body fat percentages, advice for new parents who are also competitors, the relationships between stress and overeating, how to establish more healthy eating behaviors, training after menopause, the differences between training in short versus lengthened muscle positions, when you should start posing practice, training with a hunchback, squatting with odd limb ratios and whether it's worth it, whether or not you can use double progression on all movements, managing busy military jobs with your lifting goals, and lastly, if there's any benefit to doing higher rep metabolic phases in your bodybuilding training program. As always, if you have any feedback or comments on this episode, let us know over on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/team3dmj and leave your comments under podcast number 200. So let's get into it. Here is Q&A session 20 with Brad Loomis and Eric Helms. You guys, this is episode 200.
That's wild.
I almost said it's too many, but it's not. It's never enough, really. Maybe
it's
at 2,000.
200 of many more to come.
Yeah. And
makes me wonder what we did before we came up with the podcast.
It's not a time that we recognize.
Yeah, I don't even.
Facebook arguing.
Facebook arguing.
Yeah.
No, y'all had a good little YouTube collection. How many years has it been, Eric, that we've been doing the podcast?
Almost 6 years.
In May.
6 years in May.
It'll be 6 years. And yeah, prior to that, it wasn't just Facebook arguing. There was also some propped up portrait mode S3 videos that were
I don't even know what an S3
quality.
is.
Samsung S3. That's just, like 8 generations ago of phones or whatever. Probably 9.
Yeah. And a whiteboard. And you were like 20 feet away. And you sounded like you were 100 feet away. Yeah. Yeah.
Underwater, across a football field, writing things small on a noteboard for you to easily see. Yep. All
right. Look where we are. Although, yeah, it's been that many, because like somewhere in the middle, we went from every week doing this to every other week. And here we are. Because sustainability is first and foremost. Adherence is the bottom of every pyramid, as we know, Eric.
That's right. And once you start to burn yourself out on a program, just change the frequency like we did. It's totally fine.
Yeah. So just education off the top is what we're doing here. Okay. Cool. Well, thank you, listeners. That's all I want to say. Thanks. I know it's 200 and you could have started listing at like 199 or this one, but I'm going to assume you've heard every single one of them. And so thank you.
And if you haven't heard every single one, shame on you.
You don't even deserve to listen to this.
Do you even lift?
That's right.
That's true.
Do you even listen?
Yes, that's correct. All right. Well, someone listens or at least knows that we have a way to ask questions, because we're going to start the top of this Q&A sesh with a couple that we got from our case study Q&A form, which is on our website all the time. It's also probably been mentioned in the intro of this. It's also at the bottom of every newsletter we send out. And it's the first place we go to find questions. Often it gives us podcast topic ideas too. So thank you guys for all your submissions. But we have a couple that we want to start with today before we get into the Instagram questions. So let's go with number 1. This is from Jordan. He asks, I hear you guys talk about RPE and proximity to failure a lot, especially when discussing the bigger compound lifts. Is that always necessary? I know it's not for beginners, but does everyone eventually have to start using that method? I really like just running programs based on percentages and making sure my weights go up every few weeks or so. And I've been making gains I'm happy with for like the last 3 years. But when I hear it discussed so much in the industry, I feel like maybe I'm missing something. Am I somehow shooting myself in the foot by not learning how to use RPE like all of your athletes?
Well, first, I would say that not all of our athletes necessarily use RPE. We talk about it a lot because it's a useful tool and it's a way of talking about proximity to failure in more quantitative terms, which is actually something we haven't had previously, but we've always had to mess with. So even if you were to go back to the 90s or the 80s or the 70s of training program prescription, when people would just use percentage 1RM or RM methods, you would have to think about what proximity to failure will I achieve with this prescription. So the whole reason why you can't say, hey, we're going to do 3x10 at 90% of 1RM is because it's impossible. Most people can only do, 3 to 4, maybe 5 reps at most, depending on the exercise. So when we used to write percentage 1RM based programs exclusively, you still have to understand the predicted RIR or RPE that someone is going to be at, and then think about whether you want that or not. Like if you were a strength and conditioning coach for an explosive sport and you wanted to prescribe someone power training, you would have to think about, all right, well, I only want them to do 2 reps at 80% of 1RM because I want them to be really far from failure so they're still moving quickly. So we never really thought about it in terms of the RPE for a given set or the proximity to, or the RPE for a given set, but we did think about proximity to failure because we're trying to achieve a certain velocity or ensure that the reps are completed is probably the most straightforward way. And you kind of had to just predict, well, at what rate will I be able to go up and load, and how close do I want them to ride that line? And will they occasionally miss reps, and how much am I okay with that? So like, for example, if you have an ambitious program and you're riding with percentage 1RM, you might have them try to do triples at 95% of their 1RM at the end of an 8-week block. Obviously, if they tried to do that in week 1, they wouldn't be able to. Most people could only get like 1, maybe 2 reps at 95% of their 1RM. So you're anticipating a rate of strength gain that they can achieve in 8 weeks. And that's okay. You just have to be aware of the limitations, and you need to have a plan of what do I do if I can't match that rate of progression. And then you also need to think through, am I okay with matching the rate of progression, but it being pretty easy to do so? So for example, the inverse of writing an aggressive program where in 8 weeks you're trying to do multiple triples with 95% of 1RM is trying to do, multiple sets of 3 with 87% of 1RM. After 8 weeks of strength gain, if it's a successful program, that might be really easy. That might be something that you could do for 9, maybe 10 reps, depending on how much strength you gain in that block. So this is going to enter your calculus no matter how you do it. And even if you're following programs where someone has done that calculus for you, like if you were to take a program where someone has written progression based on percentage of 1RM, they've already done that. So it's useful to look at it and think, why are they giving me 5 at 80% here or 3 at 90% here or what have you? So I think it's important to understand that you don't have to use RPE by any means, but understanding your proximity to failure is an integral part of writing programs, no matter how you prescribe them. And everyone does think about it. So I think that's point 1. And then point 2 I would make is it's absolutely 100% fine to write a program with percentage 1RM. And if you are currently able to progress over the course of a block, you're doing enough right. If your if your estimated 1RMs are going up, fantastic. You are making measurable quantitative progress, and that's probably sufficient. I don't think you necessarily need to change anything.
Yeah. Go ahead, Brad.
Well, I was just going to say, I was, first of all, to Jordan, I like this question. I really, borderline love this question because it leads to so many, fun discussions that we can have. And I kind of feel somewhat privileged that I get to answer this question with Eric, who, kind of almost made his, academic name on RPE. But one thing I did want to kind of get into was just to be a little bit more, how should I say this, applicable to Jordan here, being that he says he's made gains in the last 3 years. So he's probably, 3 to 5, maybe 6, 7 years in the gym, probably solid intermediate. And then just kind of get a little bit more into the nuts and bolts of how this would apply to athletes per se. Before I get into that, though, Andrea, did you have something that you wanted to tack on or to chime in with?
No, what stuck out to me about Eric's little piece there is that you mentioned as a programmer the things you need to know, and I'm just here kind of thinking, if I'm just an athlete, I do a good job of maybe picking the right resources or people to either give me or coach me or buy a program from, then like Eric said, like the percentages were thought out by someone intelligent, then like I don't really need to worry about it. So like if you don't want to coach and you don't want to be a programmer and you're just like, I love lifting and I want this kind of done for me, it can be, right? Like you don't have to.
It works until it stops working,
True.
Like there was a point maybe 2007 or 8. So I had been lifting for 4 or 5 years, actually probably right around where Jordan is, where the expected progression rates in programs, which is, not that there is a progression rate that is appropriate for each training age. You need to do the right amount of stimulus to adapt, and then you get the progression rate you get. But So the combination of how much stimulus I was getting out of your quote unquote stock standard programs and the rate of progression they expected, I regularly couldn't meet, and I didn't know what to do about it.
Right.
Like I'm trying to do 5-3-1, but I can't increase my bench, squat, and deadlift 5 pounds every month, which doesn't sound like much, but that's 60 pounds a year. So is that realistic? It's absolutely realistic if you were a guy who was 190 pounds like I was at 6 foot and trying to go from a 3-plate deadlift to a 4-plate deadlift. Yeah, I could go from 315 to 375 in a year at that stage of my development. But that stage ended, and then I'm not going to go from 500 to 560 in a year. Most people aren't able to do something like that.
Right.
So yeah, I think basically this won't be a problem until it is for many athletes.
Yeah. And then making progress on your physique is different than making progress in the like the weight on the bar. So maybe
Yep.
he has hit his he doesn't creep up every cycle and he's fine with that in terms of weight. But like if his physique is still progressing and that's his goal, then he could also just be like, it's fine.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead, Brad.
No, that's actually a really good point because he says that he's making gains, and I didn't even think about it as physique gains. I was thinking of it more, load on the bar. But yeah, for bodybuilders, ultimately, if you're seeing improvements on your physique, and say that you never hit failure, and you never really, you get hard reps in there, but you never really get those grindy reps, or if they happen, they only happen like maybe on the last set. Do you really have to worry about RPE? Well, kind of like Eric said, you just kind of keep running with it until it no longer works. And then you'll have to, change one of the variables that we talk about, increasing effort, higher RPE in this particular case, or more frequency maybe, or a little bit more volume, or, some of the variables that we have to kind of to start to change up. But with respect to Jordan, I kind of suspect he's probably using RPE and just doesn't really know it.
Yeah, that's what I
And
heard you say. Yeah.
I hear that a lot. I hear that, I don't use this RPE thing. And the only thing I can tell you is that, I can never finish the last repetition. Well, I mean, you are using RPE. It's just you calling it something different.
Yeah, your label's different. Because I know when I was doing like a lot of CrossFit training, it'd be like 80% effort. And I'm like, well, it's kind of the same. Not the same, but like it's a measure of
Similar
effort.
concept, yeah.
Yeah. And much beyond that, I can say that I really like it as a tool. But just like any other tool that we have. And I think one thing that Jordan might benefit from is just kind of playing around with assessing his last reps that he's doing in his current program. Just kind of start kind of evaluating yourself. Okay, I got done with that. It wasn't slow. Which usually if the rep does not slow down, you're talking that there's usually 3 reps in reserve, between 2 and 3. I usually call it a 7.5, where it's 2 for sure, maybe 3. But just kind of start randomly assessing what your last rep felt like and giving it an RPE, because then you'll kind of know, well, that's something I can use in the future, like Eric said, when things kind of stop working. Because if things are working great right now and he's never hitting slow repetitions, keep running with it until it quits working. Either you're not seeing the changes on your physique, or you're not seeing the progressions like Eric talked about. And then all you got to do is just say, okay, well, now I just start doing a few extra hard, slow repetitions, But yeah, just kind of doing an assessment and having a baseline right now, I think would be very useful. And then this RPE thing will not be quite so scary, and at least you're familiar with it and know if you need it or not.
Great. Do you feel like we did that one justice, or do we have a final word on, am I missing something?
It would be good, whether you decide to program with RPE in mind or not, to have some awareness of your proximity to failure. And I'm essentially just repeating what Brad said. He was like, hey, take notice of how much your bar speed is slowing, or your cable speed, or whatever, And like that does come into play to some point depending on your goals, and the degree to which it matters is goal dependent. So there's a pretty cool line of research called velocity loss. So we have a tracker on the bar, and you're instructed to lift each rep as explosively as you can. And then once you reach a certain percentage velocity loss from the first or fastest rep, we look at those outcomes. So for example, if you did a rep at 0.48 meters per second, which would be probably the speed associated with a moderately heavy load, like, maybe 80% of 1RM, or a little bit higher than that for your first rep on, say, a squat. If you were to have a 25% velocity loss, that's one quarter drop in speed, 0.36 meters per second. Once you did that, you would stop. And that's a pretty noticeable slowdown. But there are studies comparing different velocity losses, like 0%. How many reps can you do without losing any speed, compared to 30, 40, or sometimes even 50%, which will make most of your sets to failure. You can't always hit a 50% velocity loss. And one of the interesting findings is that when you do velocity losses over 25%, and this is published in a recent meta-analysis by Hickmott, it might be a little better for hypertrophy, because you're getting closer to failure and you're performing more reps per set. So it's, more volume, and also a higher proximity, or a lower proximity to failure, I should say. You're training closer to failure and potentially recruiting more muscle fibers per set, is better for hypertrophy. However, training with a velocity loss less than 25% seems to be better for strength and power, because maybe you're managing fatigue a little bit better, and you're preserving those reps where you can output maximal force. So the goals might be a little bit different. And I'm not saying that you should never do those slow reps if your goal is strength, because long term, hypertrophy is helping your strength. But it might be something to think about. Like, if right now I'm in a strength block, maybe I don't want to be doing all these crazy grinders, especially at lower moderate loads, because you can only grind out 90%. There's no fast 90% of 1RM speeds. But and a little interesting finding, though, is that when you looked at the various sub-analyses in that hypertrophy analysis, while the 40 and 50% velocity losses, which were the only velocity losses measured that were over 25%, were generally better than things under 25%. The difference between a 40 or 50% velocity loss and a 20 to 25% velocity loss was actually quite small. So it tells us that, yes, going a little closer to failure and doing a few more reps per set might help you a little bit in terms of hypertrophy and kind of these homogeneous research lab-based programs, but not nearly what you'd expect, because doing a 20 to 25% velocity loss is about half of the possible repetitions you could do in a set. So that means they're basically saying, if we compare 3 sets of 12 near to failure to 3 sets of 6 with that same load, it produces pretty equivalent hypertrophy. Not exactly the same, it's still leaning in favor, but it just goes to show you that even if your goal is hypertrophy, there is a point which additional volume, reps per set, and getting closer and closer to failure has diminishing returns. And I think basically what you're experiencing right now, maybe you are far from failure and you're progressing in these percentage or 1RMs, fantastic. This is a great time where you don't have to do as much to get nearly optimal gains. So you're definitely not shooting yourself in the foot, and you are probably having a more sustainable approach in the long run. And you can, increase the intensity, quote unquote, the proximity to failure, like Brad said, do more slow, grindy reps, or change another variable, like Brad said, maybe do more volume, additional sets when you need to, but certainly not before that point. It would be necessary.
Eric, if I can make a little side tangent that could really contribute to the familiarity of RPE, do you know if there is some sort of a percentage of velocity loss that like the human eye actually picks up?
Yeah. I haven't seen anything published on that. Maybe I have seen something published on it.
That's a good question, Brad.
It is a great question. And so I can tell you, because I've actually participated in studies on velocity loss and watched my velocity. And I think the point at which I notice that the bar speed is slowed down, and the point at which it's visibly noticed by someone else, differ based upon how you're performing reps. So for example, if I just train without any intention to maximally accelerate the bar, I think other people and myself notice the bar speed slow down around the same point. However, if you've ever tried to train where you're trying to make the bar go as fast as possible on the concentric, you can feel yourself start to fight that slowdown. Even though it's barely slowed down, it takes more effort and you're putting more exertion into that rep that the outside person won't be able to see, but you'll definitely feel. It's like I have to work twice as hard to maintain the same bar speed. So it's a difficult question to ask, but I would say you're probably noticing once you're around maybe a 15-20% velocity loss, that rep does feel a little bit slower. So I think that I believe, with very little evidence to back it up, except for my experience in research, not the findings of the research, because we didn't answer that research question, that if you were to instruct people to do sets until they experience that the bar speed slowed down to a noticeable degree, that would probably be a sufficient proximity to failure and reps per set to make that set pretty effective and even comparable to going closer to failure, quite close to failure, is based upon the data we have.
Yeah, because the reason that I asked that is that your piece that you talked about there with the amount of drop off or the amount of slowdown that's beneficial for strength and beneficial for hypertrophy. I've oftentimes run programs more so out of, I guess, just probably overzealous exuberance, to where I'm just taking every set to when it slows down, And I mean, I don't do a lot of volume. I mean, if you took my total sets in a week, it's like somewhere between probably 60 and 80. But even then, when you're taking every set and it's consistent, every rep is consistent to a visibly slower rep, it's exhausting. And I've even actually noticed that it seems like there's a little bit of regression, like I actually kind of start to notice that I'm feeling fatigued enough that my strength is not quite there, and more so my performance. Like I know I can get this load for this many reps, and now I can't,
Yeah.
But then also, especially when I'm in a leaner state, it seems like my physique gets blurry. You know, the lines
Yeah.
that I usually, I just usually equate that to it's probably just lactic acid buildup and all these fluids that are kind of obscuring my
Well,
separation.
It's not lactic acid. That's kind of lactate is something that it's a metabolic byproduct, but it's also directly commensurate with the total energy expenditure. It's basically a fuel source.
Mm-hmm.
So the reason why you're sore afterwards is from edema and swelling from the damage that's caused. We still don't fully understand what DOMS is, and one of some of the early hypotheses where it was metabolic byproducts like lactate that are still there, but those go away actually quite quickly. So definitely not anything like that. But what is happening is that when the bar speed slows down, that is an objective way to say you have experienced fatigue, right? Because it's just physics, right? So if you push a barbell that's 200 pounds as fast as you can, that speed is the speed you can move with being able to recruit and exert all fibers to produce force maximally, right? So if you are now at 75% of that speed, putting forth maximum effort, you are fatigued through a combination of factors, and that fatigue that results in a slower bar speed and that metabolic process of actually creating contractions and putting stretch on the sarcomeres, it has lasting effects that lead to downstream muscle damage. And that downstream muscle damage is associated with inflammation that is used to the repair and remodeling process, which concurrently happens with edema. And until that process is over, you typically see a decrement in force production. And that's why probably in these studies that look at higher versus lower velocity loss thresholds, when they're only typically, say, 6 to 10 weeks long, most of them, that's like a mesocycle and a half to 2 mesocycles length study. And that's the time course of when, if you're going hard on a program and you're training to failure, you typically see a dip in performance before then it comes back up. And a lot of these programs don't even have a deload. So it's just kind of go hard for 8 weeks and then we test. So I think a lot of the times what we're seeing are higher velocity loss thresholds. It basically means higher fatigue per set. And that fatigue per set mounts as you do multiple sets, and it's going to slow the rate of apparent strength gains. It would be interesting to see what would happen if you gave them 2 weeks off and tested again. Would it still be the same as during the acute period? But nonetheless, absolutely. Velocity loss in a set is a objective quantification of neuromuscular fatigue and is related to how much muscle damage you're going to experience afterwards, which is going to be related to the amount of decrement and force production you'll have in subsequent days.
Yeah, and really the only reason I even brought that up is because I think sometimes people's call it a block or just fear of using RPE is that if they don't experience that effort, it's kind of like I'm not done yet, or I've wasted the work, or kind of whatever. But yet I've seen anecdotally on myself, and at least what I'm interpreting you're saying is that just like most things, you've got to periodize that. You've got to periodize blocks where you purposely don't want that proximity to failure and that much effort in all of your repetitions, as opposed to other blocks when you do kind of want that. So that just, I wanted to kind of throw that in there because I thought it was a pretty beneficial part of the conversation.
I totally agree. And theoretically, while we don't have, say, a 12-month versus a 12-week, velocity loss study where, say, for the first, 6 months, they go through a 40%, 35%, 30%, 25%, 20% velocity loss, and then they go into even 15, 10, taper test, which would be quite interesting. Could we potentially retain some of the muscle mass gains that are early on, but then get away from those fiber type adaptations that come from training close to failure, which aren't as great for power. And this is more relevant for like a power athlete, but for pure 1RM strength, you probably don't really care about some of those fiber type adaptations, but you just want to keep that size. And since we know you don't really start to see big differences in hypertrophy until you start going below 20%. You have a very brief period there where you get to maintain high bar speed, not produce a lot of fatigue, but train with heavy loads. And this whole time while your proximity to failure is changing, your load's changing. And the practical way of thinking of this is to be like, okay, I'm doing a lot of sets at lower RPEs, and then I'm doing fewer sets with higher loads at RPEs that are starting to increase. And the difference between velocity loss and RPE is also important. So for example, if I mentioned earlier, if you go to like a 20 to 25% velocity loss, you're doing about half the reps in a set. Well, if you do that with 70% of 1RM, that's going to be, say, 5 to 7 reps. So you're going to be around like a 5 or 6 RPE. But if you do that with 85% of 1RM, the set starts at a 5 RPE because you're only going to get 6 reps at most. So if you go to a 20 to 25% velocity loss, you're going to finish around a 7 or 8 RPE, right? Because you're going to do 3 or 4 reps out of that, 6 RM load. So it's going to be a higher RPE just by nature of you're starting closer to the end of that tunnel.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now I feel
I don't think we gave enough information on that question, Andrea. Do you?
Well, and I feel like we sufficiently answered that and then some.
Thanks for listening to our podcast. This episode has been really enlightening.
This is a question and answer episode.
This is literally the question and the answer. No, that was really good, guys.
What's going on, 3DMJers? Eric Helms here. Thanks for listening to our podcast. I just want to take a second to tell you about MASS, Monthly Applications in Strength Sport. This is a monthly research review that I put out with Greg Nuckols, Dr. Mike Zerdos, and Dr. Eric Trexler. We cover the most up-to-date, peer-reviewed research in the world of strength and physique sport that's directly relevant to your practice as a coach or an athlete. We provide our reviews in written format, but also, since you enjoy our podcast, in audio roundtable reviews where we discuss the research in depth. Finally, we also do video concept reviews where we cover a broader topic in video format for your learning. For fitness professionals, you can take quizzes on MASS content and earn continuing education credits for most of the biggest certifying bodies in the fitness industry. If you want to sign up and get a subscription, head over to 3dmusclejourney.com and click on the products tab. Thanks for your time and thanks for listening.
Okay, question number 2 from Christine. I have become increasingly interested in competing in physique sport, but I'm unsure about which federation and division. I will always train as a natural athlete, and I'm thinking I'd like to compete in figure or fit body, but I'm questioning if I will be big enough. How do I know if I've put on enough muscle to compete in those divisions and look like I belong there? Some people tell me I'm too small and that I should set my sights on bikini, but that doesn't interest me at all. I like the posing, the definition, and the detail required in the non-bikini divisions. I'm definitely willing to play the long game. I love the process and the lifestyle of bodybuilding, so I can certainly wait to compete. The big questions are, how do I know where I belong in terms of federation or division? And how do I know if I need another season or seasons of building? And how low does my body fat need to be roughly to compete in figure or fit body?
So once again, another great question. I thought this was a really good question. And before we even get into, the particulars of how low does my body fat need to be and et cetera, I want to kind of address, her first concern of where she fits. And so it's time to kind of pull the stools up to Uncle Brad's story time. But I remember vividly coaching an athlete who did bikini and hated it, absolutely hated it, and was really not going to do any physique sport, ever again. And naturally, we Skype session, we talked about a lot of things, and you could just tell this person did not have the personality for bikini. Imagine a tomboy doing bikini. That's not exactly the situation here. But my point is that really go for the category that you feel like fits your personality. Exclude everything else, in my opinion. I really feel like if this person would have just, kind of done the middle ground, figure or, maybe even fit body, because fit body doesn't usually have the high heels and things like that. You can kind of be in your bare feet.
Depends on the Federation. But
Federation.
yeah.
Of course. Yeah. But I just kind of felt like they would have gotten more out of it, and actually had fun, and so naturally got them up on what ended up being the bodybuilding stage, actually. Didn't really have the physique for it, a little bit undersized, not real good symmetry, pretty good, darn good conditioning, ended up, I want to say got 5th out of 7 in a pretty well attended women's bodybuilding category, but had a ball. Loved it. Loved the posing. Shoot, I'm drawing a blank. The routine, the posing routine, the 90-second routine. Loved that. Loved the crowd interaction. Just had a ball, and placed 5th out of 7. So that's just kind of the first thing that I wanted to convey to her, was just worry about all that other stuff kind of down the road as you're going through your journey and you're building your body and you're doing your training. Do something that fits your personality. Because I can certainly tell you, thank goodness there was not physique and classic bodybuilding and these kind of things when I got into it. Because trust me, physique does not fit my personality. Me to get up there and do a physique routine would look similar to Donald Trump dancing, super herky jerky, just awkward.
He's so good at it though.
That would not fit me at all. My personality is bodybuilding, just get up there, grin, grit your teeth, flex hard. That's my personality.
Yeah.
That's a really good answer, Brad.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think too, it's fair to say that like people want different things out of their sport, and some people only at certain points, right? Because this can change for the same person. Like in the same sport year after year, is like, are you trying to place the best you can place, feel like you belong there? Are you trying to do what's going to be the most fun? Like you just said, Brad. Are you like, and to some people, fun is investing 6 years till they feel like they belong in the division that they want to compete in. So there's really no right or wrong. And when Christine says like, some people say I'm too small, like, but what do you say? Because if you're too small, but you're happier in that division, then that's fine. But if the other people saying that stuff actually, for whatever reason, does matter to you, and you know that, and you recognize it, and you need to, do whatever you need to do. But there's just, I think the specifications of the division or the judging criteria matter less than like your personal criteria for what you want out of your sport.
Yeah, and that's a great point. That's a great point, because some people get more enjoyment out of excelling in something that they're really good at. And if you've got the physique, say for classic bodybuilding, even though you might like, physique better, and you might like the performance of it, but that you will excel in classic bodybuilding, well then, yeah, especially if you're fit for classic bodybuilding, but yeah, that's actually a good point, Andrea, is that you might be better suited for excelling in something that, you don't necessarily want to do. Like my son, he loves playing linebacker, but he really excelled on the practice team as a fullback. And that's where he kind of contributed to the team, and he really liked it. He really enjoyed doing that. So that's actually a great point.
Yeah, I'm going to echo what both of you guys have said, because it's on the money. I do think it's also worthwhile to put this in the framing of a new competitor. Like for example, I've known a number of experienced competitors who, especially with these new divisions that have come out now, maybe 10 years after they got into the sport, they made the switch. I can think of examples of very muscular but drug-free competitors who went, you know what, if I don't compete as a bodybuilder, but if I compete in, men's physique or classic bodybuilding, I can compete against tougher competition, potentially even people who are not natural or aren't quite as natural as I am. And I could, up my game and have a higher stage to compete at. So there's been examples of that over the years. Top natural female figure competitors switching to NPC to see if they can qualify for nationals, or a number of natural bodybuilders who I'm aware of who have jumped into classic physique or men's physique. So that is a decision, I think, that is easier to make once you've experienced the divisions that are out there. And then you can also decide, what is more fun for you. Do you care about the differences in divisions, or are you mostly interested in getting the experience of being good at something, like you both have said? And I think that's going to differ person to person, and even year to year, and and stage of your career over time. I remember after this last season in 2019 that I did, there was one judge who mentioned to me that she thought I would be really, really good in men's physique. And I was just like, that is great to know. Never gonna effing happen. But I would rather be second in the amateurs than first in the pro division. For that, So it was just like, I thought, what would I do men's physique? I was like, maybe if I had an injury to where I couldn't train legs or something like that. But it's just, again, like Brad said, it's not the division for me. It's not what I'm interested in. And I think I also, none of us are so narrow-minded to think that that's the way everyone should think about this. But I will say that it's difficult to really know what to think about it when you're a new competitor. And I think there is value in just competing for the first time. So whether or not you choose the division which is best suited towards your personality or best suited towards your physique, well, your physique's going to change, and you don't necessarily know which division suits your personality. You might know which division doesn't suit your personality, and that's actually what the question asker says. Like, I don't really like the idea of doing bikini, but I'm not big enough to do the other ones. Well, you know what? I think honestly, this is what a novice category is for. There is, some people are very comfortable going up and competing as a first timer and looking like a first timer, but other people aren't. I would encourage you to try to be a little more comfortable not looking the part the first time you do it, because you're not actually expected to. This is one of those, we've talked about this before, Andrea, like this is one of the few sports people come into it and think they're going to be, like Tom Brady the first time they play. Like you don't start sprinting and go, as a freshman joining the track team, I'm hoping to get close to Usain Bolt, because I take this seriously. I'm a serious sprinter, so if I'm not running at least like 10.2, what am I doing as a 14-year-old, between math class and PE? So, but people do that with bodybuilding all the time. I started lifting 2 years ago. I think about, I'd like to win my pro card in my first time. So which division is best for me? It's like, hold the phone. And I'm not saying that's what this question asker is asking, but I think it is very appropriate for novices to look like novices and beginners to look like beginners. And if you're not comfortable going into the open division to look that way, then do the novice division, or the one you're most comfortable competing in, and just get your experience of what is the sport like. I think that is probably the most important thing. And you can see, what did you like, what didn't you like? And you can also get a bead on, am I more intrinsically or extrinsically motivated? Did I enjoy the process a lot? Or did I enjoy the reward ceremony and all that? And I do think, again, we generally recommend people to have a strong intrinsic motivation. But that's not to say that you can't also have an extrinsic motivation. Like, my colleague and friend, Paul Revelia, he likes physique sport. He likes competing, period. But he also likes to win. And now that he found out he did better in men's physique, he's happy to compete in that division because the cost-benefit analysis is worth it. To me, it's not. Even if that judge was was accurate in assessing my physique, and I'd be better in men's physique.
Yeah, and I can say too, like, I got interested in lifting and I wanted to compete in bodybuilding before I'd ever gone to a show. And the first show I ever attended, I competed in. And I was like, oh, there. It's not like you go looking online and you see probably, especially then, right, before Instagram really or anything. It was like, well, the people on the websites are the best people. But you go to the show and you're like, oh, they're the show winners. They're the best out of most people on stage. So like, I'm not saying everyone goes on stage looking like shit. That's not what I'm saying. But I think you'd be surprised what the average competitor looks at out of a show with 50 competitors. I think you'd be surprised if you're going to a natural show for the first time, because, if there's 10 people in 5 divisions, right? I bet you not all 50 of those people put themselves on Instagram all the time. It's probably like the top 3 or whatever in every division. So that might be a really good way to decide where you belong. And then I'm not kidding, there are people who the average person might think in clothes belongs in a bikini division. You realize like, oh, they're, top 5 female bodybuilders. Men too, especially if they have clothes on. Like the guy at the gym that's winning a bodybuilding lightweight, when you see him at the gym, if they have a t-shirt on, you would have no idea most of the time. So if you feel too small, I'd encourage you to maybe go to a show and kind of see what the average dealio is, because it's less intimidating than you might think. And also, I'm a person who would never do bikini either, and I was never big enough for bodybuilding, but like I did figure for a couple seasons, and literally the most important things are delts and a small waist, and I literally don't have those things. Like they're like my weaknesses, literally. But I did okay. I like placed pretty well, to be honest, in most of my like top 3 in most of my shows I ever did. But which thanks to posing and thanks to Jeff and all that. But then I decided after that if I was going to do physique sport again, which I thought I was, but now I don't think so. But at the time when I was like, next time I do it, I do have a really solid lower half and I do have a pretty wide back and I want to do bodybuilding. And so it changed for me over the 5 years that I was a physique competitor. It was a little bit identity and a little bit, okay, now that I've seen multiple lineups, I think I do better in this one. And also it looks more fun to not wear heels. So there's no right or wrong, and you're probably not as small as you think you are, and do what you want to do. That's it.
Yeah. And I feel like we need to make sure that we address like the final couple of questions that she's got there.
I guess.
Am I lean enough?
Is she lean enough? I mean, first of all, Christine was nice enough to give us a good amount of information here. I mean, this gal's been training since 1998. And she's done CrossFit for 5 years, from 2006 to 2011. I have a feeling she's probably pretty well developed and pretty muscular. And as far as how low does your body fat need to be, just plan on coming in lean as you've ever been. And then after that, it's just going to be a matter of, and be lean, be ready early, and then after that, it's just going to be a matter of, okay, what have we talked about prior to this? What fits your personality? Where do you feel like, and you and your coach agree you would, compete well? And then, just get up there, not expecting to be Tom Brady in Super Bowl 51 at your first time. And you got to, you got to go through the JVs and all that kind of stuff first.
And I think just because this specific question was what body fat percentage should I be at to compete?
Wow.
Is that,
you're right.
You're right.
How low does my body fat percent? Yep.
Yeah.
She does put percent need to be roughly. Yeah.
Which I think is a very common question. And it's also a very kind of analytically minded question. Like, oh, so I need to be lean. That's quantified by body fat percentage. What does that need to be at? Now, it seems like a very logical question. The problem, though, is that the way that we measure body fat percentage in anything you could think of, including DEXA, the amount of error on that is, at minimum 3% body fat. And a 3% body fat difference in the same person on stage is the difference between looking like you're 6 weeks out or being stage ready. If you're getting ready like on time and not eating up. It's the difference between the same person in a lineup of 10. Let's say they could win if they were at, a very low body fat percentage. If they were 3% body fat higher than that, maybe placing 4th or 5th is legitimately what we're talking about. So the sensitivity isn't there. And then more importantly, I would argue is that the validity isn't there, because your body fat percentage is going to be to some degree individual, and where you store it and where it's visible, how it's contoured by your muscle mass. And what you're really assessed on is how lean you look. So what you need to look like for, and it is division specific, for most divisions, is the appearance of no subcutaneous fat and being able to see every muscle group in detail. It may be a little bit less than that for bikini. You want kind of like broader shapes, but there shouldn't be anything that looks like, oh, that's body fat if I just look at that. Like in the bodybuilding division, of course, like the standard is to get to the point where you can see veins and striations everywhere. But I think more importantly is that you're going to try to get as lean as you can to where you can see visible separation everywhere. And don't worry about if that percentage is X number or Y number, because it won't matter. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen a competitor on stage who needs to lose literally another 10 pounds. And then, they get judges' feedback and they go, that judge is out of mind. I'm 4% body fat on this, handheld BIA device or whatever they got measured on. And it actually, the measurement becomes a barrier to them pushing as hard as they need to, or a source of stress, because that 3% variation is not a constant 3% variation. It can vary day to day, depending on the state that you're getting measured, the type of measurement, who is measuring you,
Hydration
the
can
device.
Throw it. Yeah.
It totally depends on the device, So if unless you're getting like a certified anthropometrist to measure certain skin folds in the same conditions like every 4 weeks and telling you not the body fat percentage, but the sum of those skin folds, or whether you have, like Dr. Gary Slater, like taking you to his lab and running you through their DEXA protocol, and only doing that every 4 weeks, in the same conditions, and you follow like a PDF worth of information on the status you need to be, how many days it's been since you worked out, the amount of carbohydrates and water you had, time of day, and your menstrual cycle all at the same time, it won't be useful data, and it will simply serve to make you feel like you've backslid, or you're doing great, or you had a schedule, I'm behind schedule, and be a source of neuroticism-driven fear and angst rather than a useful metric. Really what you want to look at are pictures over time and have someone who's experienced with the sport help you to know how close you are to the target you need to be. And then also remember that, just like we've talked about with our Tom Brady example, your first time getting shredded may not be that shredded, but it'll certainly be the leanest you've been in your life, and that's a great place to start. And then that's something you build upon over your career.
Yeah. Yeah, and I keep looking back to she's really not going the full spectrum even of like bikini to full-on bodybuilding. She's like bikini or figure/fit body. And I promise you, half the girls in bikini could do figure and half the girls in figure could do bikini at any natural show that I've been to. Or the guys, they're all shaking their heads, but they're very...
An amateur local natural show.
It could go either way,
The biggest
honestly.
differentiation between figure and bikini is going to be how bedazzled the suits are, not the physiques. That's about it.
Yeah, and obviously the winners of each tend to look like, you tend to see a pretty big discrepancy, but like the field isn't really all that different.
Yep.
Because again, the winner is like the closest to that criteria. But if there's 10 girls here and 10 girls there, I guarantee you the middle, and other than like maybe the top 3, everyone else could be interchanged, and it's just different posing. Honestly, it's very similar physiques at an amateur natural show. I don't know if that helps. Okay, so the next question is from one of Brad's athletes about one of Brad's other athletes, and so I feel like you have to answer this, Brad. So here we go. Aldre asks, what advice do you have as a father when you have a newborn but still want to train, asking for a friend, aka Phil? These are 2 of Brad's power lifters. One of them is a dual athlete, but he's about to be a dad. What advice do you have? Well, actually, they're both about to be dads.
They're both about to be dads at roughly the same time.
Amazing.
So, yeah.
So give the Brad squad some advice, will you? Drop a line for them.
Yeah. When you have a newborn but still want to train. So, well, I can tell you how not to do it, guys, because I was probably not a real what would be called a trophy father, because I kind of put my training first. But what I did do is I did my training first thing in the morning and made it part of our rotation as far as caring for a newborn. So the wife's a night owl. She would kind of take the what we called the 11 p.m. and the 1 a.m. feeding, because Xander was a preemie. We had to feed him like every 3-4 hours. And so I would be the one to get up at 4 a.m., do the feeding. And then as soon as I got done, he was usually asleep, put him to bed. The next feeding was at 7. I split and I went and did my training, 5 a.m. Now, that was kind of how I did it. I felt like I was doing my part because I was part of the feeding schedule, But looking back at it in hindsight, I wish I would have been a little bit more flexible, because sure, the wife had to do the next feeding at whatever it was. I think it was 8 a.m. But, there was times it was hard for her, to get up, get Xander fed at 8 a.m. I wish I would have been a little bit more flexible and just said, you know what, today's a day that probably I shouldn't do my training, or maybe I should do something at home, or something like that. I think it was good that it was important to me to keep it up. And I think it was good that I made it kind of part of the way that we needed to care for Xander. I wanted to be an actual part of that. I think that I wish I would have been a little bit more flexible. Okay. Back then, like a lot of us, especially when we're younger, it's kind of like it's my way or the highway. And looking back at it now, I think I would have been better off. I think my training would have been better. And I think some of my dieting would have actually been a little bit better had I been a little bit more flexible. Mm-hmm. But I think make it important, but make it part of your plan. But just be flexible with it and not quite too rigid, thinking that I have to do it this way, So I hope that helps, guys. I hope that helps because I remember
Eric and
that
I
vividly.
cannot contribute, so
I remember that vividly. This tiny little human, like literally, I'm holding my fists for the listeners apart, like maybe 18 inches. Mm-hmm. That was the human that we had to take care of.
just to put it out there, podcast number 138, Bodybuilding Dads, Brad, Jeff, and Nick. You guys remember that one?
Oh, yes.
It was like 72 episodes ago, but 62 episodes ago. But in case either one of you guys haven't heard that, I got a whole episode dedicated to it.
Yeah. Dadding in general, not just newborns.
True.
But
not
imagine,
just a newborn phase.
Yeah, which is good. But I mean, I imagine that goes by so fast. If you only train half as many days for like 6 months, you might be glad you did or something. I would imagine.
Mm-hmm. And like I said, looking back
Jeff went full the other way. Jeff said, I'm done training for how long?
For 3 months.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So maybe, flexibility sounds like the method.
I can say that probably getting up at 3:30 a.m., 4 o'clock, feeding my child, putting him to bed, going to the gym, training at 5 a.m., and doing that Monday through Friday, I feel like that at some points was probably somewhat detrimental.
To all areas and all parties involved.
Yes, exactly, including bodybuilding. So,
okay, next question from Josh on Instagram. I struggle with overeating in response to stress, and this has caused me to regularly stop tracking macros and miss weight loss goals. Do you have any tips or tricks to improve compliance and ways to reframe the negative thoughts that pop up when I overeat? Love this question.
That's a great question. And first,
very common.
Much appreciate the transparency, the honesty. I think there's a lot of people who might feel like they're blowing it. They're a bad quote unquote bodybuilder or dieter or what have you. Wouldn't want to share this because it's uncomfortable and makes them feel bad about themselves. But it's incredibly common, and it's something that I would say most people seeking weight loss or dieting experience in one form or another. So I think I think there's some insight in this question. There's actually 2 parts here. There was, how do I deal with the fact that this happens? And then how do I deal with the fact that I feel shitty about myself afterwards, right? Yeah. And I think to really dig into both of those, we need to look at, what is going on here, right? So the first thing is to recognize that stress is a trigger and that causes an emotional state that is uncomfortable and hard to deal with, and that there's a coping strategy, right? So the coping strategy is eating. And that makes you acutely feel better, but long-term pushes you away from your goals and makes you feel like maybe you don't have willpower, or you don't know how to stay on track, or whatever that negative story is that comes of that, those negative thoughts that you described. So, and this is a good question, because I think the knee-jerk response, I'll speak for myself, a boneheaded athlete, just go out there and crush it kind of mentality I have when I'm doing something I don't want, is the opposite of the Nike slogan, just don't do it. Which is almost always never helpful. So, or at least even if it does work, there's a cost somewhere else that comes from it, of just kind of railroading over your own emotional state. So the reason why it is a temporary solution at best, just to simply try to remove a habit or a behavior you don't like when it's a coping strategy, is because now you are left with nothing to cope with, right? So the thing is you probably need to look at a replacement strategy. So you've identified that eating makes you feel acutely better. What else helps you calm your thoughts and deal with stress? And this is a tough one to answer with generalities, because everyone is so different, has different personalities and experiences, beliefs, etc. You know, it might be prayer for someone like Brad, for example. It might be going on a walk. Or talking to someone who I'm close with, who I feel would understand what I'm experiencing for me. And it might be journaling for Andrea. Those are my guesses for the three of us.
Why are you so right, Eric?
It's
like he knows us. It's like he knows us.
Yeah.
And the thing is that those are all very different, but they achieve the same thing. So essentially what you want in one of these states is you want to have the space to have a agency in your choice. And a lot of the times when, like, for example, you're binge eating or you're doing something that you look back on with regret, the stress creates a lack of space. It makes us feel like something needs to happen now because I feel like crap and I need to cope. It's an emotional response. And only once the smoke is cleared do you look back and go like, damn it, I wish I hadn't done that. I'm such a blank, insert self-deprecating thing. So the question is how do I give myself the space to have the opportunity to make a decision? Right? Instead of it just kind of happening. So I would advise you to think about the different ways in which you can delay a decision and find a moment for your emotional state to calm. That might be something as cliche as counting to 10 when you're mad at someone, which we've all done in one form or another. That might be taking a walk. That might be listening to some music. That might be journaling. That might be what have you. But you just want to get that space so you can think about and reflect on where am I at right now. And at that point, you actually have the opportunity, and that's really step one, in my opinion, to make a decision about what do I do in this stress state, because the eating will make you acutely feel better. And I think we need to acknowledge that. That's why it's a repeated behavior. It's not just a negative, but it's probably not the best way to actually manage said stress. It's kind of putting a Band-Aid on the gunshot wound, and then you can think, okay, now I need to get medical attention. But unfortunately, that Band-Aid also has a negative effect that leads you to stress later. So if we can find a Band-Aid that is just a Band-Aid before you then go, okay, what is stressing me right now? Work is crazy, so I need to look at my schedule, or I need to change when I sleep, or maybe I need to change my workout schedule so I have more time for work, or I need to call my boss and talk to them about whatever. Like, there's a million ways to deal with the stresses in your life, because there's a million different stressors and a million different people out there. But essentially, you need to get the space to have a thought, and then that will naturally take care of itself as far as, do I have these self-judgments after I do eat? Final thing I'll say is that this is going to be a very difficult process of replacing one habit with another. You are going to have times when you emotionally eat still. And I think just acknowledging that this is a coping behavior, that you're just another human being on this earth with the rest of us dealing with stress, and you've learned this behavior. It's not because you're a bad person. It's this what came out of your life, and some people are luckier to have coping strategies that are maybe a little more productive and aligned with their current goals. That ain't you on this day, but maybe next day it can be. And just to kind of give yourself the compassion to acknowledge that, hey, I'm stressed and I'm trying to deal with it. Yeah, it set me back a little bit, but if more times than I used to, I can replace emotional eating to cope with my stress with something else, then I'll be better than I was before. And that's all I'm asking of myself, just to give yourself a little more compassion, because it's not going to be, oh, now I heard this podcast and now I'm going to take a walk every time and I'm never going to overeat in response to stress. It's going to be a continual process, and there's going to be backsliding and forward progress and plateaus and all the whole 9 yards.
For sure. And that everything Eric just said is so applicable to, like, again, any human that has these type of things. But I just want to throw out there that if you're like me, the only time this has ever happened in my life was post contest prep. So like there's a possibility that if you are over dieted, chronically dieted in recovery from a prep, that it's more physiological than psychological sometimes. A lot of times it's both or a combination of, right? But so just that would need to be addressed also if you're chronically under eating. That would be something.
Actually, that's a good point.
Different.
Is the stress this person's experiencing coming from the diet?
Good point.
Or is the stress from outside? Because if it's coming from the diet, then I think Andrea makes a really good point. It may be that you need to take more diet breaks, time off, diet slower, diet with a more flexible, inclusive approach to food, et cetera, so the diet itself is not as stressful. You mentioned tracking, maybe finding ways to track more loosely while still achieving the deficit you need. Taking days off from tracking, but just eating based on like a 1 to 5 hunger scale. I see Brad's nodding, so I don't want to steal his thunder if he's going to say something about that. But do be aware, if it is external stresses throwing off your diet, everything I previously said is going to apply really nicely. But if it is stresses generated by the diet, then there may be a whole plethora of approaches you can take to maintain the efficacy of said diet, but improve the sustainability of it.
Well, just real quickly to just expand on that. Number one, when you overeat, what's done is done. Don't beat yourself up. It's water under the bridge. Tomorrow's a new day. You don't have to wait till Monday or Tuesday or Friday, and you didn't ruin, months and months of hard work. It was one meal. Just take that amnesia pill, as Alberta likes to say. Be kind to yourself and move on. But what I do want to address is two things. Number one, stress causes him to regularly stop tracking macros. Listen to our transitioning away from tracking. Kind of look at some of those resources that we have in 3DMJ Vault, because you can very successfully navigate fat loss and not track a macro, or at least maybe just track your protein only. Maybe get to sometimes tracking macros leads to people not even being in touch with how normal athletes and how normal people eat. Maybe just get to a 4 meal a day approach, breakfast, lunch, snack, dinner, and get in touch with your fullness signals after each of these meals. Am I stuffed to the point that I've got this huge food baby, or am I just, comfortably satisfied and I really don't need to eat more than this, and then just kind of pay attention to the protein that you've got on your plate there. I don't think that you really need to do much more than that, as long as you're walking away from each meal satisfied, but not at a food baby. Or if you've got a food baby, it was because you just had this huge bowl of riced cauliflower. That's kind of a hunger hack that I get to sometimes utilize. But you don't have to track macros, and don't beat yourself up if you're not tracking macros and you don't necessarily know exactly what your deficit is. And then the last thing he talks about, it causes me to miss my weight loss goals. And we have to kind of remember that progress is still progress, and slow progress is still progress. There's many a time when I'm taking a gym pop athlete through a weight loss phase and I'm saying, okay, if we can stick to this plan 100%, here's my projections. You'll lose 4 pounds, 4 weeks from now, you'll lose 6 pounds 6 weeks from now, what have you. And I want to emphasize to the person, if you lose 2 pounds in the next 4 weeks, you still lost 2 pounds. Okay, sure. Maybe you didn't make the projection that we thought we were going to have. And maybe that was because our analysis was incorrectly, or maybe you did fall off the wagon and you didn't quite adhere to the exact deficit that we had. Big deal. You still lost 2 pounds. We still made progress. And so weight loss goals are good. It helps you to stay on track, but don't be married to them, and recognize when you are, making progress even though it may not necessarily be the progress that you had planned, hoped for, or had your heart set on.
For sure, for sure. And for the listeners, here are the resources that I can think of in my brain, and there might be more in the show notes, but we have a completely free course called Sustainable Fat Loss by our registered dietitian, Steve Taylor. It's at 3dmjvault.com. Whole thing is free. It is literally about tracking behavior change, how to replace them, like Eric said. All that stuff. Sustainable Fat Loss is what it's called. And then there is one that comes with our paid program, but it is transitioning away from tracking, like Brad mentioned. But there are a couple of, in the free preview of that course, even without having to buy, there's a couple of videos that might be really helpful about learning more about how tracking can not be so positive. And then search Steve, again, Steve Taylor, on our blog at 3dmusclejourney.com, because he does have I think he has a habit replacement article, and he definitely has transition away from tracking, and we have some on our YouTube channel too. So there's lots of free stuff if you want to check it out. Okay, next question is from Portia McRobbie. Total minority here, but you may or may not be. We don't know. Total minority here, but any research on training post-menopause? Not beginning to train after menopause, but already training, and some considerations to keep going?
That's a great question, and it's a common
question. Yeah.
It's a legitimate concern because postmenopausal women are producing less estrogen, and estrogen has beneficial effects in skeletal muscle adaptation. We know that estrogen acts to reduce the amount of muscle damage, so might enhance recovery. So there's reasonable questions about, okay, hey, I'm now postmenopausal. Can I still train with the same intensity, volume, load? Is my recovery different? And this has actually been not extensively researched, but has been researched. And the study that popped into head for me was by Romero Parra et al. In 2021. And it's titled Exercise-Induced Muscle Damage in Postmenopausal Well-Trained Women. So it's exactly what we're talking about here. Yeah. Women who have been training and are now postmenopausal. And the study design is pretty cool. Basically, they gave them German volume training, if you're familiar with that. 10 sets of 10 squats with 60% of 1RM. So it's a high volume protocol of squats, not necessarily extremely high effort, but yeah, by that fifth or sixth set, that 60% is going to feel a lot more like 70% and then 80% as you get further, if anyone's ever done GBT. Yeah. And they looked at muscle function, inflammation, and markers of muscle damage at 2, 24, and 48 hours post-training. And there were not significant differences between the pre- and postmenopausal groups. So I think the main take home here is that your training age is going to have, and your experience and what you've now become accustomed to, is going to have a much larger impact on what you can handle than your biological age. And a lot of the effects that we associate with getting quote unquote older, quote unquote, that we get getting with older are a combination of not only becoming older, but also getting older and not staying physically active. So for example, we've got other research suggesting that the muscle protein synthesis response to ingested protein in older people is blunted compared to younger people. But that effect doesn't seem to be true to the same degree, at least, when you look at active aged populations. So to some degree, I think you need to remember that the effects of aging are better framed as the effects of being inactive and sedentary for a longer period of time. And that is more so that youth means you can get away with not training rather than age making it like you didn't train or something like that.
I like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
A 25-year-old who is sedentary and doesn't train is going to have a better metabolic response to ingested protein and will, probably have an overall healthier and more fit body than a 55-year-old who is sedentary and didn't train. But it's not just because they're 30 years older, but it's 30 years of additional inactivity and sedentary living. So that's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin, though, is that if you're, postmenopausal now and you've been training, you've probably got a lot of training years under your belt. And I can tell you, just as someone who's 39, so younger than you, that I don't have the same body I had when I first started training, but I don't feel that much older than when I first started lifting at 21. but I do feel like I've banged myself up a lot over the last 18 years of lifting. And that perspective I know is a little bit different to, say, for example, Jeff or Brad, who have talked multiple times on the podcast how they don't have the exact same level of recovery, can't handle the same volume, and there's other effects. But I can say that there's a fair amount of research on middle-aged men and women, including postmenopausal women like I just cited, that suggests that you really haven't lost a step yet. Doesn't mean that the Grim Reaper won't eventually get us all, but I don't think you need to make substantial changes to your training specifically because now you're postmenopausal. But you might need to make changes to your training simply because you've now had X amount of years of training and you are, you might have more injuries or more responsibilities or whatever, different priorities in life. So I think it really just comes down to individualizing what's in front of you, but there is no physiological reason that you need to do something specifically different because you're a woman who is now menopause or postmenopausal.
Yeah. With your training, because like there might be other things that need to see a doctor for because of your hormone changes, I would imagine. But as far as like just this question,
oh yeah, for sure. I'm just talking about the what are you doing with your training, and your nutrition probably won't massively change either.
Yeah.
If you are, that's another interesting thing. The idea of our metabolism slowing with age, that is heavily confounded by the fact that most people lose muscle mass as they age, which lowers their energy expenditure, and most people get more sedentary as they age. So if you maintain the same level of physical activity as you did, say, 20 years ago, and if you have the same or higher levels of muscle mass, the amount of food you can eat probably won't be that much less, or the food you will need to eat. Certainly, I eat a whole lot less food than I did, but I was thinking back to when I was in my 20s, and I was personal training 20 to 30 hours a week. And I look now, and I personal train, on my computer. So, all of us coaches who complained about that we can't diet on the same amount, like Brad, you remember when we were personal trainers in the 2000s, like that might as well be like light construction work,
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah,
right.
Teaching step aerobics classes, loading and unloading plates.
I love that story still that Brad taught step aerobics. It makes me so happy. I wish I was good.
Amazing.
On to the next question. What's the least training an intermediate could do and still make appreciable size gains? What you got, coaches?
Good question. So I think there's a couple things to consider here. Is that there are intermediates who may need to be doing twice the volume of other intermediates. Okay. I know we often talk about 10 to 20 sets, or we cite the Schoenfeld study, like 10 plus sets, but those are means. And when you actually dig into the data, and I love the studies that actually report individual data point lines when you compare high volume to lower volume groups, yes, like the means are higher, but you're going to find people who are all over the show. And some people will respond much better to lower volume versus higher volume programs. So this answer is a difficult one to give that is useful to the individual, but it might be useful conceptually. All right. So if we go to that same Schoenfeld meta-analysis that suggested 10 plus sets is the fastest rate of muscle gains if you're performing that per week per muscle group, important caveat is that the 5 to 9 sets and the 1 to 4 sets, those categories also produce muscle growth. And in fact, out of the total effect size that 10 plus gave, if that's 100%, you see about 64% just doing 1 to 4 sets. Okay. Now, granted, these are mostly beginners. So I would guess that if you took the average, like, of course, if you took a completely untrained person, you had them do 1 set per muscle group per week, they would grow, because that is an infinite number times the number of sets they're currently doing, which is 0, right? It is infinitely more volume, literally, from a mathematical perspective. However, intermediate, there are going to be some who could probably maintain muscle mass doing just 1 set per muscle group per week if it was to failure and executed well, or would they have a slow decay? But I think most, that would be too little. And I would say most intermediates are also going to have a similar level of volume for the rest of their career. Something that I think is demonstrated by the literature is that you need to do more work at a higher training age, But remember that the literature being trained is a really low bar. So if we look at resistance trained, participants, they're typically, I would guess, slightly less trained than the average listener to our podcast. Yeah. Most of the people listening to this podcast are not just listening to a fitness podcast, they're listening to a bodybuilding podcast, right? So you as an intermediate posting on our Instagram, I don't know how much volume you need to do. I simply can't know. But I would say the average intermediate person who's interested in bodybuilding and trying to get as big as possible, they could probably go to about 50% of their volume and maintain their muscle mass for at least, multiple mesocycles. More than that, I might be concerned with muscle losses, and I'll explain how I came to this. So we've got some cool studies that have come out from ETSU by Travis and colleagues that have looked at deloads in high-level weightlifters and other strength athletes, and this has been shown in a few other studies as well. Not deloads, tapers. So the actual competitive taper, where typically you're reducing volume by 1 to 2/3 for 1 to 2 weeks, and primarily just doing like single reps and high load, but your typical powerlifting or weightlifting taper. And we have observed that while, that helps them get a little stronger on comp day, there are slight amounts of muscle loss. So when we're looking at highly trained individuals, like their tapers are impressive. They're lifting huge amounts of weights and they're doing a relatively high frequency of training. The volumes are kind of low, but you wouldn't look at that and go, oh, that's a muscle loss program, right? But you're observing that. So it does change. The higher you've pushed your adaptations, the more you have to do to maintain it. So I would say wherever you're at to currently, make measurable, reasonable progress, I think you could probably safely drop that to about half. And that would probably be sufficient to most likely maintain and maybe even make slow progress. And you could use 2/3 of that to be a little more confident. And that's assuming you're doing an appropriate amount of volume now. You could be doing 50% more volume than you need and actually progressing slower than you otherwise would have. So it's a very difficult question to answer, but hopefully conceptually that helps you understand.
Helped me understand.
Well, and just to expand upon it too, because he doesn't talk about if he's talking about volume or if he's talking about time frames. But Eric, you and I have kind of somewhat discussed before how we have a hard time getting the required volume in that we need without doing whole body training. So if we're talking about like days per week, I have very successfully maintained people's volume on just doing a whole body training session 3 times a week. I started off with a big compound where you're getting a lot of carryover. It could even be like bench press, row, leg press on your, or squat, leg press, whatever on your 3 days, and then just fill it out so that it's whole body training and you can get all of the volume that you need just doing a 3-day-a-week program.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
so I just wanted to
that's a good point.
Just kind of expand upon that. Just kind of think out of the box sometimes. Mm-hmm. Check off the boxes that need to be checked off, but you can do it in a very creative way that takes up very, very little of the days of the week per se.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do wonder what the motivation of the question is. Is it that I'm more time pressed now and, this is the maximum amount I can do? Because you can get creative and use things like, drop sets, rest pause, antagonist paired sets, and more compound movements to keep, a pretty effective training stimulus in a lesser time and just get ready to get in better cardiovascular shape. But if the person is more just asking theoretically, I don't know, or maybe they're just going to go through a period where they're hurt. I mean, it could be a lot of things, but most of the time, like Brad's talking about, we have a client or ourselves who are in a situation where we can't dedicate as much time or effort to training, but it's a fixed timeline, and most of the time it's a couple months or something like that. And at least in those timelines, I agree. You could take someone who's training, let's say 5 days a week for an hour and a half, and they begin to train 2 to 3 days per week for an hour, and they certainly don't regress. And that's something I'd say we've all anecdotally experienced. Yeah. So, that tells you something. There's going to be some substantive changes to the structure of training, of course, but it also means we're probably doing less isolation work, more compounds, and it's certainly you can hit pause quite easily as a trained lifter. That's kind of how I run my deloads. Like I normally do 5 to 6 exercises a day, 5 days per week for 3 to 4 sets. For my deloads, I do 3 days a week for 4 exercises, so I've dropped 1 or 2 exercises off, just doing 3 sets. That's about a 50% decrease in volume. And it's really nice because I only have to train 3 days that week. And then I'm nice and fresh coming back to it, but I can still maintain a pretty high intensity for those 3 days. So, yeah.
Great examples. Like I said, I can't do the long questions, guys. I'm sorry. We will get y'all next time. Or maybe I'll look at this next time we have a podcast episode. I need to stop talking. Okay, first question. Is it beneficial if your goal is hypertrophy to train a muscle in its shortened position versus lengthened position later, or vice versa? Order.
Right now, all the data suggests that the benefits of full range of motion training are primarily driven by training at long muscle lengths. So training at long muscle lengths is probably the most beneficial thing. I don't think that we have data to suggest training at short muscle lengths is beneficial at this stage. I would just make sure that you include the training at long muscle lengths in your training.
Okay, boom. Next question. When are you competing when you are competing in physique for the first time, when should you start posing practice?
Never too early. You should at least start getting familiar with the symmetry poses as soon as you sign up and, listen to some of our podcasts that talk about symmetry and get familiar with the looks that you kind of need to fit. But it should be ramped up, but you can start right off the bat with the symmetry poses, and then come, 6 to 8 weeks out, it's game time. You got to start practicing for conditioning every day.
Okay. Training with the hunchback. Should I be training differently or the same as others?
Ooh. I would recommend checking with your clinician. So I'm sure there's different reasons that could be, and I don't know enough.
Okay. Any tips for squatting with weird biomechanics? I have a long torso and short shins. Is my squat forever doomed?
Don't feel like you are forced to squat if you're not a powerlifter. There are other movements. And then if you are a powerlifter, definitely experiment with different stances and using heeled versus flats or vice versa. And anything else, Brad?
Experiment with high bar, low bar, safety bar. If you're married to squats, there's a lot of different squat variations that might fit your mechanics. And it's just going to be patience, trial and error, and give it a good, fair shake.
Okay.
Yep.
We're good? All right. Can you use double progression on all movements? And if not, why? Thanks.
You can use double progression for all movements if you've got infinite patience and thinking that, I don't have to go up anytime soon.
Okay. How to manage fitness demands of a job, military in my case, and desired bodybuilding powerlifting training. Managing demands.
Yep. Yeah, generally what you want to try to do is get your weight training done before days where you have to do PT. So if you're doing it on the same day and you've got to run and do push-ups and all that stuff, get your resistance training in earlier in the day. So the thing that potentially suffers is your military training. This will probably reduce any potential interference effect. And I would focus primarily on the least number of days you need to train for both while still being effective. So like if you've got to do PT 3 days a week, probably don't train any more than 3 days a week on your resistance training, and just really focus on ways to make those an effective 3 days. And that way you don't have as much overlapping recovery. Even if it would be theoretically better for you to train 4 or 5 days a week, which I'm not even necessarily convinced it is, that's not necessarily true if that's eating into your recovery.
Okay, very last question. Is there any benefit to alternating between a strength phase and or a metabolic phase like higher rep 15 to 30s in the long term, and when your goal is pure hypertrophy?
Probably. There is a recent study that showed a group that trained purely in the 8 to 12 RM range for 3 successive blocks didn't quite gain as much muscle mass as a group that did an interspersed hypertrophy block with 2 strength blocks, if I recall correctly. And this is theoretical in nature, but there may be some benefits to training across a spectrum of rep ranges. There's some studies also showing staying purely in an 8 to 12 RM range on all days versus having a daily undulating program where you have like a strength high rep and moderate rep day doesn't produce the same effect sizes on hypertrophy. That's only one study. There's actually a couple studies that show that. But overall, if there was a small benefit, it would be small, but hey, we care about small benefits. So there's probably rationale to vary your rep ranges over time. That said, I don't think you need to do a quote unquote metabolic phase that is like really high rep training. I think if you never touched more than 20 reps in all movements, that would be totally fine. I think the rationale is, like probably for training, like maybe at the highest reps you go with like 20 to 30 sometimes, and you spend some time in like the 8 to 15, and you have some time in like the 4 to 8, and those would be good blocks to alternate between. Even beyond just hypertrophy, that allows you some time off of joint stress. It also allows you some time to just have a mental deload from focusing on one type of training for a while. Heavy training can be very fatiguing mentally after a while. High rep training can as well.
Okay. You guys, I feel like we did it. That was episode 200. Y'all did 13 questions in all. I'm not going to lie, the first question ended up being like 5 questions that someone probably had, maybe 10. The second question might have been like 3 more questions. But that was a really valuable episode. And thank you guys. Do you have anything to say to episode 200 listeners?
Just thank you for hanging this whole time. And it's an honor to still be doing this and to be getting questions and having the opportunity to hopefully provide some helpful answers.
And we will not be hurt if you have not listened to all 200
Yes,
episodes.
we will. I will personally.
Liar. You speak for yourself. If you don't listen to every single episode, it's an insult to my soul.
Yeah. No, and thank you so much for contributing to everyone who did. We appreciate you interacting with our stuff. And we'll see you next time.
Hey guys, this is Coach Alberto Nunez. Thanks so much for listening to our show today. Thank you so much for hanging out with us. I wanted to take a moment to remind you guys that we have a giant video library of educational materials at 3dmjvault.com. The vault is a place where we have organized our best information, paired it up with some of our favorite resources, and shared with all of you guys in one online database. We have courses on contest prep, hypertrophy, posing, fat loss, postseason recovery, and a whole lot more. Most of it is free. Some of it is for purchase to help support this podcast, and we continue adding pieces of updated content to it every couple of months that members always have unlimited access to. Once again, that's 3dmjvault.com, and we really hope you like it.